Perlisten is strongly associated with controlled directivity. What audible problems are you trying to solve by controlling dispersion?
Trying to take some of the room out of the equation. Once you put a speaker in a room, everything changes. Rooms are tough, especially with bass, but especially with reflections. So most people can do something about their walls. But like, look where we're sitting right here. There is no treatment on the floor, and there is some treatment on the ceiling, which is fantastic. But that is a big problem, a point of first reflection to the end user, and that will give you that confusing, your brain will get a smeared sound because they're getting direct sound and they're getting late reflected sound, and it'll be like, it just doesn't sound quite clear or as clear as it could be. That's one of the things we're trying to solve. Oh, there's another thing, dynamic range. So our speakers are in 90-91 dB efficiency, and they're 4 ohm load, so they're easy to drive. So we notice that many times there isn't a good dynamic range to accurately reproduce music. So dynamics is another one.
How do you decide the target pattern, wide horizontal versus controlled vertical?
Again, to reduce, we want to keep our vertical narrow, about 25 degrees, because by the time that 25 degrees gets to where you're sitting, it's got you from feet to the top of your head, but it's never hit the floor before it got to you. And then horizontal, we want that to be as wide as possible, so we have a big sound stage and also a deep sound stage.
How much of your sound is about the direct sound versus the all reflections in a room?
Yeah, I mean, the room's part of the equation. And we designed the speakers assuming that most people don't have treatments. So the room is every part of the sound. You can get into trouble if your room has no absorption whatsoever. That's no speaker's going to sound good in there. Right. So, but we tried to design the speaker so it would work in normal living spaces with maybe a carpet, couch, maybe some drapes.
When you're tuning, what's the red flag you listen for that tells you directivity is wrong?
A red flag would be if the room is overly treated, for sure, because then the room sounds dead and your high frequency will be just all sucked up. That would be one red flag. The other red flag would be if the room is too reflective. The speaker is going to do what the speaker does. So that the trick is placement and trying to make the best of your room that you can do.
Where do you place the speakers first? And then where do you go from there?
As a general rule, you shouldn't stick them against the back wall. You should bring them out a bit, just like you were seeing right here in this room. And you don't want them right against the sidewalls. So, and then what you need to understand with each speaker is what are its characteristics to towing in. And some need to be extremely towed in. Some don't need to be so much towed in. Perlisten needs to be a little bit towed in. So you don't want to be seated in the middle of the room, because if your seat's in the middle of the room, you're going to have a big standing wave there for having no bass. So you kind of want to split the room up into thirds, and maybe you sit 2/3 back and the speakers are within that first third. And then you also want to try to do a bit of an equilateral triangle. So if I'm sitting this far away, then the speaker should be that far wide. People spend their whole lives mastering how to set up systems. And we work with custom installers. That's what they do. They bring the product out and they make it sound the best they can for somebody. That's an art.
Which measurements correlate best with what listeners report?
Neutrality. The reports we get from when I do demos at audio shows, and I set the system up in a terrible room, by the way. It's usually a conference room or something in a hotel or whatever, and we do our best to which would very much simulate a average room that has no treatments. What we find out people say is it sounds they don't know that it's low distortion. They just say it sounds different. It sounds very open, very wide, very clear, and very dynamic. What people also don't realize is when it gets loud to you, that's usually distortion is your cue that it's getting loud, and that's when you turn it down. So when a speaker has low distortion, you'll find you're listening louder than you normally would because it doesn't sound loud. So that happens a lot at the trade shows.
What does science and engineering, no smoke and mirror, look like inside Perlisten day to day?
It's computers, it's modeling, it's analysis, it's build it, and then it's measure it with microphones and the Klippel machine, which does a couple of thousand automated measurements with a computer. So that's what it looks like day to day. The other thing it looks like day to day is, since we're so small and we're so nimble, we can make a product like that if we want. So we really listen to our customers. And if they say, look, we have this problem, we need a solution, we'll research it, and if it sounds like it's the right thing for us to do, we do it. So that would be the other side, is being in tune with our customers.
Since you talked about the Klippel, what role do tools like Klippel, nearfield scanning, and a full Spinorama style datasheet play in your design?
Critical. From day one, that's back to the science and engineering. I mean, because how do you know, when you want to design something, how do you know what it's actually doing unless you measure it? You have no idea. You might throw some speakers in a cabinet, be like, hey, it sounds good, but you don't really know what it's doing. So that is 100% Perlisten DNA, very important. And the other thing is, we publish all the data online. So any one of our speakers, you can download the data sheet, and we show you the Klippel data. We show you the dispersion characteristics, which is colloquially known as a heat map. And we share all of that. And that's something that makes us quite different. And that's really important, especially for an integrator or a custom designer, somebody that's making a cinema. They need to know, okay, if I have 6 seats here, how am I going to know if the speaker is going to cover those six seats, and how loud it's going to go, and what its frequency pattern looks like? So this gives them some idea of how to design.
How do you balance optimize a graph with optimize the emotional connection?
Listening. We always listen. So good example is A series. Right before that came out, it was designed, it was measured, everything looked great. I sat down and listened to it, and I said, something's not quite right. So they changed an inductor from a solid core to an air core, and that fixed it. So everyone at the company has a great ear and is really personally into music. So we like to think if we like it, the customer will like it. But listening is key. We also have our differences. Like, I'm more sensitive to the high mids than some others. So I might tend to treat a room a little bit differently, or aim the speaker.
As personal taste.
Personal taste. Yeah.
What manufacturing or QC step makes the biggest audible difference in consistency from one speaker pair to the next?
So that would be part of our production process, is to measure and check drivers. And especially in some particular models like the limited edition, they were also then unboxed and rechecked to make sure everything was within half a dB each driver. So that was pretty extreme. But we are very much all about QC. We have a high rejection rate of some things, because we want to make sure that when the product goes out the door, it's doing what it's supposed to do.
That's not easy.
It's not easy, and it's part of the cost, right? So when people are like, you guys are making gobs of money on that stuff, but it really is a love to make sure that we want every product to consistently work and be what we would want to have in our own home.
So do you have your Perlisten in your home?
Of course I do. Yes, that's why I joined the company.